Well, this story begins long, long ago and far, far away in a kingdom where a queen was walking in her garden. And she noticed a plant. It was a rosemary plant, and it seemed to be thriving. It was bright green and healthy. And she saw that around that rosemary plant were several small rosemary plants. And she said, "Ah, even the rosemary plant has children, and alas, I have none." And it was true, because the queen and her king, although they had longed for children and wished for children and prayed for children and hoped for children, they had no children. And so she continued as she looked at that rosemary bush, and she said, "Oh, if only I had a child, I wouldn't mind if it were nothing more than a rosemary bush." And you know where this is going, don't you? Several months later, in the warmth and heat of late summer, that woman gave birth to a rosemary bush. And I don't know if you've ever given birth to anything, or if you've ever contemplated what happens when somebody gives birth to something, but you've got to admit, that sounds painful. But the queen and the king, they were so pleased. Oh, the sweet little rosemary plant. They named her Rosemary, of course, and they got a special pot for her, porcelain, the finest china, and they got soil, organic soil. They put in several amendments, and they planted that rosemary bush, and they made sure that it was fed 4 times a day with milk. They were so happy. After a while, the queen's nephew came to visit. Now, he was a king in Spain, young man, and they were so happy to have him visit. They showed him around the palace. They showed him around the garden. They introduced him to their rosemary plant, and he was surprised. They seemed so taken with this rosemary bush. But as they told him more about the rosemary bush, well, he was also taken with the rosemary bush. In fact, he was so taken with the rosemary bush that he decided that he would have to take the rosemary bush. And so the morning that he was to leave to return to his kingdom, he crept stealthily into that garden, and he took the rosemary bush, pot and all, and he hurried back to his ship. And he brought also with him a goat, so that the goat could be milked 4 times a day, and the milk could be fed to the rosemary bush. When he got back to his kingdom, he planted the rosemary bush in his own garden, and he got a bench to put right next to it, and he sat on the bench and admired his rosemary bush. Well, now I have to tell you that the king, he liked his garden, and he liked the rosemary bush, and he liked playing the flute. And so one day he decided to put all those together. He took his flute down into the garden. He sat on the bench next to the rosemary bush, and he began to play the flute. And to his great surprise and his excitement, out of the rosemary bush, there emerged a woman, young and beautiful. And because this is a fairy tale, she looked at him and he looked at her, and they fell instantly and deeply in love. Well, the king began to spend a lot of time there in the garden, sitting on the bench by the rosemary bush, accompanied by Rosemary, and sometimes playing the flute and sometimes just talking, but they were in love. Tragically, one day, the king learned that war had been declared, and he was required to leave the kingdom to lead his soldiers into battle. He went immediately down to the garden, and he said to Rosemary, he said, "While I'm gone, I don't know how long I'm going to be gone, but while I'm gone, I think it would be safest for you to go back into the rosemary bush and don't come out. When I return, I will come down to the garden. I will play 3 notes on my flute, and you will know that it is safe to come out then." She nodded and went into the rosemary bush. And then the king went to his gardener, and he said, "I have to leave, but while I'm gone, take good care of my garden, and make sure you take especially good care of my rosemary bush, because if anything were to happen to that rosemary bush, well then, I'll take good care of it," said the gardener. And the king left. Well, now when the king was gone, the villains enter this story. They happened to be the king's 3 young sisters. We shall just call them the mean girls. When their brother was gone, they said, oh, this is a great opportunity for us to snoop around in his bedchamber, see if he has any secrets or anything. So they began to look around and they found his flute. One of the mean girls said, you know, our brother's always down in the garden, sitting next to that rosemary bush, playing his flute. Maybe there's something to that. So they took the flute down to the garden, and the 3 of them sat on the bench. And the first girl picked up the flute and she blew as hard as she could, but she could only get out 1 note. Let me do that, said the second princess. And she blew as hard as she could, 1 note. And with the third princess, the third of the mean girls, it was the same. But inside the rosemary bush, Rosemary heard those 3 notes from the flute. She figured that the king was back, and so she emerged from the rosemary bush. And those 3 mean princesses, they knew 2 things right away. Number 1, that's why their brother had spent so much time sitting by that rosemary bush. And number 2, that rosemary girl, she was more beautiful, far more beautiful than they were or could ever hope to be. And because they were mean girls, they picked up sticks and began to beat Rosemary. Finally, she was just barely able to creep back into the safety of that rosemary bush. Well, the next morning, the gardener came out to the garden to check on how things were, and he saw that that rosemary bush was looking kind of droopy. In fact, it didn't look well at all. It looked like it might die. In a panic, he ran to his cottage and he said to his wife, I think the rosemary bush is going to die, and you know what that means. I'm going to flee for my life. And he did. He fled into the forest. When nightfall came, though, he climbed up into a tree, figuring that that would be the safest place to be in a forest, perhaps filled with strange creatures. And he was attempting to sleep, although have you ever tried to sleep in a tree? No sleep numbers on those branches. And then he heard noises coming from the base of the tree. He looked down through the thick canopy of leaves, and there he saw 2 dragons, a male dragon and a female dragon. Although I don't know how he knew that. Perhaps the female dragon just had pink scales or had a bow in her hair or something. I'm not sure. But he seemed to know that it was a male dragon and a female dragon. And as he listened, the female dragon said, so what's the news from the palace? And the male dragon said, nothing special. She said, oh, you always say that. There must be some little bit of news. He said, well, the only news I have is that, you know, that the king, he has that favorite rosemary bush. I think it's going to die. Oh, she said, that's too bad. Isn't there any way to save it? Well, there may be a way, said the male dragon, but I can't tell you. Well, why can't you tell me? Well, if someone were to overhear, it would not be good for us. Who's going to overhear? We're in the middle of the forest. Right. Well, so here's the thing. If someone were to take 3 drops of blood from my windpipe and a tablespoon of fat from the nape of your neck, and were to boil them together and spread that concoction on the rosemary bush, it might live. She said, oh, it's a good thing nobody overheard that. But of course, someone had overheard that. It was the gardener. And so he waited until he could tell by the rhythmic snoring that both of the dragons were sound asleep. And then he leapt down from that tree. He picked up a big rock and he killed both of those dragons. And then he took 3 drops of blood from the male dragon's windpipe and a tablespoon of fat from the female dragon's from the nape of her neck. And he ran home to his wife. He said, quick, boil these 2 things up. And she said, ew, why? And he said, it could save my life. She said, all right then. So she boiled them up, and with the resulting concoction, the gardener ran to the garden and began to spread it all over the rosemary bush. And then he waited and watched in horror as the rosemary bush died. But luckily, before it did, out of the rosemary bush emerged Rosemary, the girl, not the bush. He said, oh, come with me. She was looking a little bit weak and pale. She'd been beaten by those three mean sisters. He said, come with me. I'll take you back to my house and you can recuperate there. He ran back to his cottage and he said to his wife, quick, let's tuck her into the bed in the guest room and make some of your famous chicken soup. She's got to get better before the king comes back. Well, after a while, good news came. Peace was declared. The king's forces had been victorious and he was able to return home. He immediately went to his room, got the flute, went down to the garden, sat on the bench and played 3 notes. And nothing happened. And then he looked more closely and he realized that his beloved rosemary bush was dead. Furious, he ran to the gardener's cottage and he said, I thought I told you to take care of my rosemary bush. Now my rosemary bush is dead and you know what's coming next. Oh, wait, said the gardener. I think you'll like what I can show you. And he took the king into the next room where Rosemary was lying in the bed. She was looking a lot better than she had just a few days before. And the king said, Rosemary, you're alive. And Rosemary said, sweetheart. Well, she may have said his name, but we don't know what his name was. If you know fairy tales, you know that most fairy tales, they have a quota, 1 actual name per fairy tale. This fairy tale, it's Rosemary. We don't know what the king's name is. So he said, Rosemary. And she said, sweetheart. And they embraced and they kissed and they began to make plans for a wedding, a summer wedding. They thought that would be nice. And you know the things that you have to do to get ready for a wedding. You got the dress, the shoes, the hair, the jewelry, the food, the music, the favors for the guests and the invitations. And as they were talking about that, suddenly the king said, you know, I think we should invite your parents. And so the king and the queen from the far off country, they were sent an invitation and they accepted gladly, though at the time they had no idea the identity of the bride to be. And when they came there and they found out that the bride was none other than their dear Rosemary, who they thought had been gone for so long and was probably dead, well, they were overjoyed. And because they were good and kind people, and because they were so happy to see their beloved Rosemary alive and happy and being married, they forgave the king for the plant napping. And so the wedding was held. And there was music, and there was dancing, and there was singing, and there was storytelling, because you can't have a good party without storytelling, right? And everybody celebrated and celebrated and celebrated. There was so much fabulous food, and they'd arranged for a local mead hall to make something special for them, something made out of passion fruit and honey, and just a touch of, rosemary. Everybody loved it. In fact, everybody had the best time. And the celebration lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. But that celebration was just the prelude to a lifetime of happiness and warmth and sunshine and joy. And may we all be so blessed. And that is a story called, no surprise here, Rosemary.